Late April 1945. A thin layer of morning mist clings to a captured stretch of farmland on the outskirts of Aschaffenburg, Germany. The war is collapsing, but no one out here knows exactly how fast. The air carries the dull metallic smell of burned vehicles and wet soil, the aftertaste of a front that has only recently moved on. Along a narrow dirt road, a column of young German women, auxiliaries, signals clerks, nursing assistants, sit silently on the ground inside a newly formed U.S. military enclosure. They have been captured only hours earlier. Their uniforms are dusty, their faces hollow from days of retreat. Some stare at the earth. Others try not to meet the eyes of the American MPs watching from a few steps away. Then, unexpectedly, a sound cuts through the silence. A soft crackle, a radio dial turning. A warm, fluid rhythm begins to spill into the morning air, brass swing, a tempo none of them have heard in years. Jazz. The women lift their heads, startled. For a moment, confusion washes over them. This was music their government had condemned, yet here it played freely, without fear, drifting toward them like something from another world. And this single moment of sound would become their introduction to a reality they had never imagined, a reality that forms the beginning of their story. The final spring of the war in Europe unfolded with a kind of chaotic acceleration that no one inside Germany had been prepared for. By early April 1945, American forces were pushing rapidly through Bavaria and Hesse, dismantling pockets of resistance that only weeks earlier had seemed capable of slowing the Allied advance. Cities fell in days. Bridges collapsed behind retreating soldiers. Supply routes vanished. And within this collapse, thousands of women serving in auxiliary roles suddenly found themselves swept up in the final disintegration of the German war machine. These women were not frontline combat troops. Many had begun the war as volunteers or conscripts in support organizations designed to free men for the battlefield. They staffed Luftwaffe communications posts, typed orders, worked radio lines, decoded signals, or handled logistics. Others belonged to medical units, Red Cross detachments, or local air defense support teams. Together, these branches formed the loose network of the Wehrmachtelferinnen, the female auxiliaries who had been pulled deeper into the conflict as Germany's manpower dwindled. Through much of 1944, their duties remained relatively stable and structured. But by 1945, the world around them had changed beyond recognition. Entire battalions were dissolving, commanders were abandoning positions, and orders became contradictory or impossible to follow. For women assigned to communication units, the final weeks were a blur of collapsing lines and lost signals. For nurses and medical assistants, it was a steady flow of wounded with fewer supplies and fewer staff. By mid-April, as American armor divisions broke through central Germany, many of these female auxiliary personnel were pushed in hurried convoys moving east, attempting to escape capture. Trucks broke down. Fuel ran out. Some women were ordered to walk. Others simply wandered with retreating remnants, unsure where their units had gone. The sense of administrative order that had governed their service for years disappeared almost overnight. At the same time, American forces were preparing for an entirely different transition. After months of hard fighting, they were now tasked with securing vast territories, processing unprecedented numbers of prisoners, and stabilizing civilian populations. The U.S. Army had detailed protocols for handling POWs, but these procedures were designed primarily for male combatants, not for large groups of women who had served in uniform but were not technically soldiers under the Geneva Convention's conventional definitions. Still, the Americans adapted quickly. By late April, field enclosures and temporary holding areas were being established near every major road artery. These were simple spaces, open fields, barbed wire, guard posts, and a few administrative tents. They were not permanent camps, but short-term collection points used to separate genuine combatants from medical personnel, administrative staff, and civilians accidentally swept into military formations. Into these enclosures came thousands of German women, some frightened, some defiant, many simply exhausted. They carried whatever they had managed to keep during the retreat, small rucksacks, notebooks, mess tins, a roll blanket tied with string. Their uniforms were often mismatched, worn down, or improvised. A few still tried to maintain the discipline they had been taught, standing straight when addressed, or saluting instinctively before remembering that the war, for them, had effectively ended. Most had grown up under years of propaganda, depicting Americans as chaotic, violent, culturally corrupt, and racially dangerous. Jazz, swing, and American popular culture had been banned as intartite music, degenerate music, associated with racial mixing, moral decline, and foreign influence. Teachers, radio broadcasts, and party newspapers had repeated these themes constantly. For many of these women, the United States existed only in caricature. This made their capture psychologically complex. They did not know if they would be mistreated. They did not know what would happen next. Their officers were present, often offered no guidance. Some auxiliaries whispered that Americans shot SS members on sight. Others believed they would be sent to the U.S. as forced labor. The uncertainty weighed heavily on every movement and every silence within the enclosures. Meanwhile, for American military police and infantry units assigned to guard the prisoners, the scene was equally unfamiliar. They had certainly taken female captives before, nurses, clerical staff, civilians caught in crossfire, but never in such large numbers. Many GIs approached the situation with caution, unsure whether these women had received weapons training or held ideological commitments that could pose a threat. But once the initial processing was completed, most guards recognized them as what they largely were: tired, hungry, and shaken support personnel caught in the final collapse of their military system. Food distribution became the first priority. Blankets and basic medical checks followed. The Americans wanted order, not trouble. And in most enclosures, once the prisoners realized that the guards were not interested in revenge, the tension began to loosen. Still, fear lingered, an invisible weight that kept the women quiet and withdrawn, waiting for the next instruction, the next development, the next unknown. And it was within this fragile atmosphere, in the uneasy calm of April 1945, that one unexpected element would enter the enclosure and shift the mood in a way none of them could have predicted. The sound of American music carried on a field radio, a sound that leads directly into the deeper landscape of this moment. The American army that advanced into Germany in 1945 was operating at the edge of its logistical limits. Every division was stretched thin, responsible not only for combat operations, but also for securing bridges, clearing resistance pockets, feeding civilians, and handling tens of thousands of prisoners. Yet despite this immense burden, U.S. policy toward POWs remained structured, consistent, and remarkably disciplined compared to the chaos unfolding on the German side. Female prisoners, however, presented a new administrative challenge. They arrived in mixed groups: Luftwaffe helpers, Red Cross volunteers, clerks, drivers, and communication staff, each with different uniforms, insignia, and legal statuses. Some were technically military. Some were semi-military auxiliaries. Others had been swept into retreating columns without ever serving formally. For the Americans, the priority became classification, determining who was a legitimate POW, who was a civilian, and who required further. This process often began with a brief interview conducted through interpreters. Women who had served in the Luftwaffe's Signals Corps or in anti-aircraft support were separated for additional documentation. Medical personnel were noted, but typically processed quickly. None of this was punitive. The U.S. military simply needed accurate records as it advanced deeper into enemy territory. The policy directive was clear. Female POWs were to be kept separate from male prisoners to prevent harassment, exploitation, or disorder. This separation was not always elegant. Many of the enclosures were improvised: a fenced pasture, a cleared orchard, or an abandoned farmhouse courtyard. But the intention was unmistakable. American officers understood that the war was ending, and maintaining stability mattered more than ever. Food rations were another challenge. Supply lines stretched all the way back to recently secured French ports. and German road networks were choked with refugees and destroyed vehicles. Yet even with shortages, the U.S. Army attempted to provide standardized rations to those under its control. Female POWs often received the same basic field portions as male prisoners: bread, canned meat, boiled potatoes, thin soup when available. These meals were far from plentiful, but they were consistent, and to many of the women, they represented a surprising level of order and predictability after weeks of collapse. More surprising still was the cultural atmosphere of the American enclosures, where German wartime society had been highly controlled, especially in the realm of music, radio, and public expression. The U.S. Army brought with it an entirely different spirit. GIs carried small hand-crank phonographs, harmonicas, and field radios tuned to the American Forces Network. News, swing music, and jazz drifted freely across bivouac areas. Even in the midst of war, American soldiers clung to elements of home. The rhythm of Glenn Miller, the warmth of Duke Ellington, the unmistakable sound of a Benny Goodman clarinet. For German male POWs, this music was often just another reminder of their defeat. For female prisoners, many of whom had been teenagers when jazz was banned, it carried a deeper significance. They had grown up with strict cultural limits. American swing associated with subversion, moral decay, and what propaganda framed as racial impurity. The state had taught them to fear this music, or at least distrust it. Hearing it openly, casually, from the very people they were taught to fear, challenged the foundation of those beliefs. But this was not a calculated psychological strategy. In most cases, the presence of music grew simply from the soldiers' own routines. Radios were used for news, weather reports, and entertainment. Many guards kept them running during long shifts for companionship. Yet, unintentionally, the effect on prisoners was profound. The familiar strictness of German discipline was gone, replaced not by violence or humiliation, but by a surprising informality. Guards chatting among themselves, someone laughing at a joke, the soft buzz of swing music cutting across the stillness. Within that environment, many female POWs experienced an internal disorientation that they struggled to express. They had expected hostility. They had expected punishment. What they found instead was a kind of pragmatic indifference. The Americans were not there to judge them. They simply wanted order, quiet, and a manageable camp. Still, the tension was not gone. Many women feared what the next day would bring: interrogation, transport, or forced labor. Others were haunted by uncertainty about their families or the fate of their cities. Yet the enclosures gradually settled into a rhythm. Morning roll calls, rations, medical checks, long hours of waiting. A routine as dull as it was necessary. And it was in the middle of this routine, somewhere between fear and relief, that the unexpected sound of jazz, drifting through barbed wire and early morning mist, would begin to alter the emotional landscape of the enclosure. A shift subtle at first, but powerful enough to mark the beginning of the next layer in this story. For many of the captured women, the first hours inside an American enclosure were defined by silence, a guarded, defensive quiet born from years of indoctrination. They had been warned that American soldiers were brutal, undisciplined, and morally dangerous. Teachers, newspapers, and Nazi broadcasts had shaped their expectations long before they ever saw a uniformed American face to face. And yet, when they were finally inside U.S.-controlled territory, little of what they had feared actually materialized. Instead of shouting or intimidation, the guards were mostly businesslike. Instead of punishment, there were instructions delivered with routine clarity. Stand here. Move there. Wait. The women watched cautiously as food was distributed, as blankets were handed out, as the Americans checked for injuries or dehydration. The realization came slowly, but unmistakably. They were not going to be harmed. This moment, the collapse of fear, was the human shock that rippled through the enclosure. Women who had kept their eyes down now dared to look around. Some whispered quietly to one another, exchanging tiny confessions of relief. Others simply sat, staring at the foreign insignia on the guards' jackets, as if trying to reconcile the reality before them with the threat-filled image they had been taught. The arrival of jazz magnified this sense of contradiction. It was not just music. It was the audible evidence that their worldview had been incomplete, constructed. The sound of brass and rhythm carried with it a freedom that many had never experienced. And it forced them, gently but unmistakably, to confront how different the world outside their propaganda bubble truly was. Few things symbolize the ideological divide between Nazi Germany and the United States more sharply than jazz. For years, the regime had denounced it as degenerate, banning broadcasts, regulating dance halls, and censoring records. In the official narrative, jazz represented everything the dictatorship feared: foreign influence, racial integration, creative spontaneity, and individual expression. To the regime, it was disorder. To American soldiers, it was simply home. So when the female POWs heard jazz drifting from a field radio, the moment carried a weight far beyond simple entertainment. Many had never heard this music clearly before. Others had only caught faint, illegal broadcasts late at night during their youth. Now it played openly, confidently, in the hands of the army they had been taught to fear. Some of the women listened in stunned quiet. Others looked around as if expecting someone to silence it. A few, younger and more curious, found themselves drawn to the rhythm despite the unease it stirred. To them, jazz felt like something forbidden finally stepping out into the daylight, and there was a strange, unsettling beauty in that. For the Americans, the music meant nothing extraordinary. It was a morale lifeline, a connection to home. Playing jazz while guarding prisoners was as natural as smoking a cigarette or sharing a joke. Yet this cultural normalcy was precisely what struck the women so deeply. The casualness of it revealed how sharply controlled their own lives had been. And in that collision, forbidden sound meeting new freedom, something inside the enclosure shifted. Although it appeared informal, the American approach to handling POWs had a clear tactical purpose. The U.S. Army understood that stability inside the enclosure reduced risks. No panicked attempts to escape, no incidents that could escalate into violence, no need for harsher measures. Maintaining calm wasn't just humane, it was strategic. Small details contributed to this controlled atmosphere. Guards were instructed to avoid unnecessary shouting, to maintain predictable routines, and to regulate the flow of prisoners through processing. Radios, though not used intentionally for psychological influence, served as ambient noise, something familiar to the guards and disarming to the prisoners. Music helped prevent long stretches of tense silence, which could fuel fear or spark panic. The female POWs, trained in environments where discipline was rigid and authority absolute, found this quiet structure strangely foreign. There were rules, certainly, but they were enforced without theatrical displays of power. The guards weren't interested in humiliating anyone. They wanted order, not domination. This environment unintentionally undercut the ideological expectations the women carried with them. Instead of confirming the propaganda they had been taught, it contradicted it at every turn. And in that contradiction, the psychological defenses many had built began to loosen. The combination of humane discipline and unexpected cultural freedom set the stage for what would happen next. The moment when the enclosure's atmosphere would shift decisively because of a single radio's music. A shift that deepens in the next set of angles. For the captured women, the most profound impact of captivity was not physical, but psychological. They had lived within a system where information was filtered, culture was regulated, and deviation from official norms was discouraged or punished. Their worldview had been shaped not by open experience, but by directives: what to believe, what to fear, what to reject. Inside the American enclosure, that framework began to fracture. It started with small observations. American guards speaking casually with prisoners, handing out water without hesitation, offering medical help with no expectation of loyalty or gratitude. The women noticed laughter among the guards, a sound oddly out of place in wartime captivity, yet strangely reassuring. They noticed how American soldiers interacted among themselves, with a relaxed camaraderie that contrasted sharply with the rigid hierarchy they had known. Then came the music. The jazz drifting through the morning haze forced an internal confrontation many of them had never anticipated. If this music was supposedly corrupt, why did it feel warm? If the Americans were supposed to be violent or uncivilized, why did they appear measured, even indifferent? Each moment chipped away at the ideological armor they had worn for years. Some women later described this period as the first time they questioned the cultural boundaries they had grown up with. Others remembered it as the moment they understood that the world outside the Reich was far more nuanced than they had been told. The psychological unraveling was not dramatic. It was quiet, gradual, and deeply personal, preparing the ground for the turning point soon to come. While the female POWs experienced captivity through the lens of shock and recalibration, the American soldiers saw a very different picture. To them, these women were not ideological combatants or threats. They were logistical responsibilities at the end of a long and exhausting campaign. Many GIs had spent months fighting through dense forests, fortified towns, and mined crossroads. They had seen ambushes, lost friends, and marched through villages still smoldering after artillery fire. Compared to those realities, guarding a group of female auxiliaries felt almost surreal. Most soldiers approached the task with a mixture of professionalism and mild detachment. Another assignment, another duty to perform without unnecessary complications. The soldiers were aware of the propaganda that had shaped the enemy's expectations, but they did not feel compelled to challenge it. Their goal was simple: prevent escapes, maintain order, and keep everyone alive until processing was complete. If music made their shifts easier, they played it. If the prisoners listened, that was their business. Yet this very indifference became meaningful. The guards' calmness, their refusal to treat the women as ideological enemies, and their reliance on familiar routines created an environment that gently undermined fear. To the soldiers, jazz was just a reminder of home. To the prisoners, it became evidence of a different world, one where authority did not always demand fear and obedience. In this mutual disconnect, a subtle understanding began to form, even before a single word was exchanged. By late April 1945, Europe was saturated with brutality. The Eastern Front was collapsing in waves of destruction. Cities burned. Millions fled. In many regions, surrender offered little protection. News of atrocities spread rapidly. Through rumor, through experience, through whispered accounts shared at night between frightened groups of displaced people. The women entering American captivity knew this. Many expected the worst. What they received instead was restraint. It would be wrong to romanticize the situation. Conditions were harsh. Supplies were limited. The enclosures were crowded, cold, and uncertain. Yet compared to the violence occurring elsewhere, the atmosphere in American-controlled areas represented a kind of moral line, a refusal to descend into the retributive brutality common in collapsing wars. For the women who had internalized the idea that they would be punished simply for wearing a uniform, this restraint held enormous moral weight. It demonstrated, without speeches or declarations, that their captors drew a distinction between service and intent, between ideology and individual humanity. This moral contrast, harsh expectations met with measured treatment, prepared the emotional ground for what would become the pivotal moment of their captivity. The moment when music, of all things, would reveal that the war's harsh boundaries were thinning and that the world beyond the barbed wire was already shifting into something new. This shift brings us directly to the turning point inside the enclosure. The moment began almost without intention. It was late morning when an American MP, a young corporal from Ohio, returned to his post carrying a small field radio under his arm. He had borrowed it from a supply truck parked near the road, hoping to catch a midday broadcast from the American Forces Network. For him, it was routine. For the prisoners on the other side of the wire, it would become a turning point. He set the radio on an ammunition crate, adjusted the antenna, and turned the dial. Static cracked through the air, sharp at first, then settling into a low hum. A few of the guards glanced over. Some welcomed the familiar background noise. The corporal tapped the radio with 2 fingers, twisting the knob until a warm, rounded melody emerged. A brass opening, smooth and fluid, unmistakably American. The first notes belonged to Glenn Miller's In the Mood. At once, several female POWs turned their heads. Some froze mid-movement, as if the sound itself were an intrusion into their controlled silence. Others instinctively straightened their backs, surprised by the rhythm, the clarity, the sheer openness of the music. A few appeared visibly confused. They had heard propaganda claim that this music represented disorder, corruption, or decay. Yet here it played calmly, confidently, in the hands of soldiers who seemed entirely unaffected by the state warnings that had defined the prisoners' youth. The guards noticed the reaction. One MP, leaning on the wire fence, exchanged a brief look with another. Not a word was spoken, but the atmosphere shifted. The music carried a warmth that contrasted sharply with the cold tension that had lingered over the enclosure since the women's arrival. A few prisoners exchanged quick glances, unsure if listening was allowed, unsure if even reacting was safe. When the clarinet's solo slid into its signature swing pattern, something subtle happened. A young woman, barely in her 20s, wearing the faded blue-gray uniform of a Luftwaffe signals unit, exhaled as if releasing a breath she had been holding for hours. Her shoulders eased. It was only a moment, but it marked a ripple moving through the group. Another woman closed her eyes, listening carefully, perhaps comparing this sound to the warnings of her youth. A third hesitated, then allowed herself to watch the radio openly, no longer pretending she wasn't listening. The guards did nothing to stop them. The Americans simply let the music play. When the broadcast shifted to Duke Ellington's Take the Train, the mood deepened. The fast, bright rhythm struck a contrast to the dull heaviness of captivity. Some of the women reacted with cautious fascination. Others looked almost dazed. They had entered the enclosure expecting fear. They were now being confronted with sound, free, unregulated, unpunished. To them, this was not entertainment. It was contradiction. A few whispered quietly among themselves. The German words were soft, uneasy. Darf man das Horn? Are we allowed to hear this? Wieso spielen sie das? Why are they playing this? Das ist verboten gewesen. This used to be forbidden. The music filled the air while the guards maintained their usual positions. Rifles slung casually, boots shifted in the dust, eyes scanning the perimeter. The normality of their behavior further unsettled the women. They realized, slowly, that the Americans did not view the music as a statement or a provocation. It was simply part of their world, a world these prisoners had been denied access to for years. As the broadcast continued, the corporal adjusted the volume slightly lower, letting the melody blend with the quiet murmur of camp activity. He was unaware of the impact it was having. To him, the songs were just a link to home, a reminder of theaters, street corners, and smoke-filled bars thousands of miles away. But to the prisoners, each note chipped away at the image the Reich had constructed. Every beat contradicted the warnings they had believed. The music carried with it something they had not expected to encounter in captivity, a sense of normalcy, even humanity. And in that moment, the enclosure felt less like a place of fear and more like a space suspended between two worlds, the collapsing system they had come from and the unfamiliar openness they were now confronting. The guards began to notice this subtle shift. The women were sitting differently. Their posture was less rigid. The tension that had gripped the enclosure since the morning was loosening, almost imperceptibly, but unmistakably. What none of them realized, not yet, was that this single act, this unplanned moment of music, would soon open the door to the first small exchanges, the first shared glances, the first fragile steps toward communication. Steps that would define the turning point that followed. The convoy moves deeper into the captured German countryside, leaving behind the shattered town and entering long stretches of forest-lined road. The rain has stopped, but the sky remains swollen with low, bruised clouds, turning the world into a muted palette of grays and damp browns. Inside the truck, the German women sway with every turn. The engine drones steadily beneath their feet, a rhythmic vibration that feels almost hypnotic after the chaos of the morning. Yet no one sleeps. No one dares. Every bump in the road reminds them of how little control they have left. It isn't fear that fills the truck now, not the sharp, panic fear of being captured, but a heavier, slower form of dread. The dread of not knowing. Were they being taken? How long would this journey last? What would the Americans do with them? The interpreter riding with them senses the tension and speaks gently. You are being transported to a processing site. You will be safe, but the words feel distant. Safety is a concept the women have not trusted for months. A 19-year-old Luftwaffe clerk sits near the back, fingers tightly gripping the edge of the wooden bench. She mutters softly to the woman beside her. If only we had known it would end like this. I would never have joined. Her companion answers quietly. Most of us wouldn't have. The admission lingers in the air, the kind that would have been unthinkable only a year earlier when loyalty was enforced with iron and fear. But now, within the walls of a rumbling American truck, the truth feels strangely permissible. The convoy rolls past farmland still scarred from recent fighting. A farmhouse missing half its roof. A barn burned to its frame. An overturned wagon abandoned on the roadside. The women stare through the slats in the truck's wooden walls, watching their country, the 1,000-year Reich, reduced to broken fences and scattered debris. One of the women whispers, This is all that's left." An American corporal walking alongside the truck hears her tone, though not her words. He glances up briefly, then ahead again, boots crunching on the gravel. Suddenly, the convoy slows. An American MP walks back from the lead vehicle and taps the side of the truck. "Stay seated. Everything is fine." The women stiffen instinctively. They hear shouting up ahead, not frantic but firm. The rumble of engines quiets as the column comes to a full stop. Through the gaps, the women catch glimpses of movement. 2 American soldiers are blocking the road. Between them stands a group of displaced German civilians. Women, children, an elderly man with a cane, holding a white bedsheet tied to a broken broom handle. They're pleading for something. Food? Water? A doctor? The German auxiliaries watch, struck by the scene. These are not soldiers, not prisoners, just ordinary people caught in the storm of collapse, desperately appealing to the very army they were taught to fear. The Americans respond calmly. They speak with the interpreter. They distribute something, tins, bottles, cloth bundles. It lasts only a few minutes before the civilians are guided safely off the road. The convoy resumes. Inside the truck, the captured women exchange looks. The moment is small, but significant. If the Americans treat even random civilians with restraint, perhaps captivity will not be the nightmare they imagined. As the truck picks up pace, the women begin to talk, softly, cautiously, about what lies ahead. Will we be separated? Will they send us far away? Will our families even know where we are? No one has answers. A woman in a Red Cross armband, older than most, sits upright and speaks with quiet authority. We must assume nothing, but the Geneva Conventions apply. The Americans will follow them. Her assurance carries weight, not because she sounds confident, but because she sounds honest. Across from her, a former signals operator wipes her face with the back of her sleeve. She has not cried since the moment of surrender, until now, when the lack of certainty finally becomes too heavy to swallow. Outside, the GIs march or ride alongside the trucks, weapons slung but not raised. They look tired, not triumphant, not aggressive, just worn down by months of fighting. Many are barely older than the women they guard. One MP, pacing beside the truck, adjusts his helmet and mutters to the sergeant next to him. "Crazy, ain't it? We used to dream about the war ending. Now it just feels strange." The sergeant grunts. "War ends slow. Your head doesn't catch up as fast as HQ reports do." He glances at the truck full of German auxiliaries, and neither do theirs. Without warning, the sky opens. A curtain of rain slams onto the convoy, drumming against metal, splashing against boots and helmets. The trucks are covered, but water seeps in through cracks and seams, dropping cold onto the women's uniforms. One auxiliary flinches as a stream trickles down her back. Another pulls her overcoat tighter, teeth chattering. The American driver shouts back, "Hang in there. Road's rough from here." The wind howls through the forest road, shaking the vehicles like brittle toys. Branches whip overhead. The world outside becomes a blur. Inside the truck, the women huddle closer, instinctively seeking warmth from one another. In another life, they might have been strangers. Now, they are bound by shared uncertainty. The truck rattles violently as it hits a pothole, nearly throwing several women off the bench. A young auxiliary steadies herself and murmurs, "I wonder if this is what our prisoners felt, being taken somewhere they didn't choose, their fate in someone else's hands." No one answers. They all understand the implication. For years, Germany had transported prisoners across Europe, Soviet, French, Polish, American, often under far worse conditions. None of the women in the truck had control of that system, but now they were experiencing a shadow of what so many others had endured. The silence afterward is long, heavy, introspective. A change in terrain. After nearly 2 hours, the forest thins and fields open up again. Signs appear of a larger, more organized American presence. Fuel depots, field kitchens, engineering vehicles constructing temporary bridges. The convoy's pace slows as they approach a checkpoint guarded by heavily armed soldiers and sandbag barriers. The interpreter stands and announces, "We are arriving at the processing camp. Follow instructions carefully when the trucks stop. Do not run. Do not speak unless spoken to. You will not be harmed." Her tone is firm but reassuring, the kind that demands obedience while offering stability. The women brace themselves, their bodies tense, their breathing shallow, their palms cold against the wooden seats. The moment they've feared since dawn is finally here. Through the gaps, the women see barbed wire, guard towers, rows of tents, a long administrative building constructed from prefab panels. American soldiers move in coordinated lines, guiding new prisoners, carrying crates, checking papers. Everything is efficient, controlled, procedural. This is not a punishment site, not a dungeon, not a brutal holding pen. It is an orderly POW processing facility. Yet to the captured women, the sight is overwhelming. Because it is real, because it is final, because it confirms what they can no longer deny. Their war, their world, is gone. The brakes hiss. The trucks stop. The engine noise fades into the rain. For a moment, no one moves. Then an American MP pulls the tarp aside. His expression is neutral, professional. "All right, this is it. One at a time. Slowly. Welcome to the end of the road." The women rise, legs trembling, clutching the last remnants of their belongings. They are not marching into danger. They are marching into the unknown. And the unknown, after years of certainty, even brutal certainty, is terrifying. The first hours inside the American processing camp were defined by procedure, precise, methodical, and far less chaotic than the women had feared during the long journey. After dismounting from the trucks, they were guided in small groups toward a registration tent where U.S. Army clerks worked behind wooden tables stacked with papers, tags, and fountain pens wrapped in cloth. Rain dripped from the edges of the canvas roof as each prisoner stepped forward. Names were recorded, units identified, roles, ages, hometowns, all carefully transcribed onto index cards that would follow them through the Allied system. The women stood in line, shivering in their damp uniforms, watching the rhythmic movement of American pens scratching across forms. It was strangely quiet. No shouting, no intimidation, no hasty searches or rough handling. The guards maintained a firm posture, but their discipline was calm, almost understated. For the auxiliaries, who had braced for humiliation or harsh treatment, the normality of it all was disorienting. One clerk raised his eyes briefly and said in slow, deliberate German, "You will receive food. Hot coffee soon. Wait there." The clarity of the instruction caught several women off guard. hot coffee in captivity. They were then led to a second tent where their personal belongings were inspected. Knives were confiscated, badges removed, papers stored separately. But sentimental items, photographs, letters, a pocket mirror, were handed back. The Americans made no effort to confiscate them unless they posed a security concern. For many of the women, it was the first moment of emotional release. A signals operator in her early 20s clutched a worn photograph of her younger brother, tears pooling but not falling. A typist from the Reich Labor Service breathed out slowly when her pocket Bible was returned unharmed. Even the simple act of offering a prisoner her belongings back with a neutral nod struck them as unexpected. They had grown up in a system where mercy was often viewed as weakness, especially toward prisoners. But here it was routine. After processing, the women were escorted to a designated enclosure separate from male POWs. The Americans followed Geneva Convention guidelines meticulously, maintaining gendered spaces and ensuring the women were assigned minimal hardship duties, if any. Most were not given labor tasks at all, unlike many male POWs sent to farms or road crews. Inside the enclosure, rows of tents stood on flattened ground, each with a straw pallet or captured German bedding. The women entered cautiously, scanning their new environment. It was Spartan, but cleaner than expected. Buckets for water stood at regular intervals. A small medical station had been established near the entrance. A female army nurse, working with a medic, examined minor injuries and took notes for further treatment. That afternoon, the first meal arrived delivered on metal trays. It consisted of boiled potatoes, canned meat, and a ladle of thin soup. To the American soldiers, it was a standard camp ration. But to the prisoners, many of whom had eaten little during the final chaotic weeks of the war, it felt almost luxurious. Some ate silently, savoring the first warm meal they had tasted in days. Others hesitated, still unsure if accepting food from the enemy carried any hidden consequence. Yet hunger eventually overcame suspicion. As they ate, the familiar crackle of the American radio returned, the same one that had played jazz earlier that morning. The corporal from the transport column was on duty near the enclosure, and he set the radio on a crate once again, letting the broadcast travel across the camp. This time, the women listened without fear of punishment. Some listened with curiosity, others with quiet disbelief. The music did not erase the reality of defeat, captivity, or the devastation of their country, but it created a strange emotional space, a momentary reprieve from the weight of uncertainty pressing on all of them. By evening, when the rain finally eased, the women settled into their tents. The sky turned a pale violet, streaked with smoke from American kitchen fires. The guards patrolled slowly, speaking in low voices, their boots crunching softly against the wet ground. Inside the enclosure, the prisoners lay awake longer than they admitted, absorbing the unfamiliar environment, listening to distant radio chatter mixed with the soft hum of jazz fading into static. Their war was over. Their role, whatever they believed it once meant, had dissolved into the cold April air. Now, they existed in a space between the life they had known and the future none of them could yet imagine. And as the night deepened, the question lingering in every tent was the same. A question that would soon be answered with consequences far larger than the women could see from behind the wire. The days that followed settled into a rhythm. Not familiar, not comfortable, but predictable in a way that eased the initial tension. The American camp staff maintained strict routines. Roll calls twice a day. Medical checks every third morning. Food distribution at consistent hours. For the German women who had lived through the disordered collapse of the Reich, the structure felt almost surreal. Yet even with structure, uncertainty hovered in every tent. The women whispered questions each night beneath the low canvas roofs. Would they be transferred deeper into Allied territory? Would they be interrogated? Would they be held until peace treaties were signed? Would they ever return home? Some of them had surviving families somewhere in the ruins of Germany. Others had no idea if their cities still existed. News traveled slowly, carried only by rumors arriving from newly captured prisoners. But amidst this uncertainty, something else began to unfold, a shift in perception that none of the women could have predicted before their capture. Reports from across Europe in 1945 are consistent. American POW camps, despite shortages and overcrowding, generally upheld the Geneva Convention. Conditions varied by region and logistics, but the systematic brutality the women had feared simply did not materialize. They were fed, housed, given medical care, kept separate from male prisoners, and, crucially, treated with procedural neutrality, neither humiliation nor favoritism. This neutrality unsettled many of them more than hostility would have. They had grown up in a system that preached absolute loyalty and absolute enmity, a worldview where enemies were demons and mercy was weakness. But the Americans did not act like the propaganda posters. They behaved like guards, not conquerors, professionals, not avengers. It was a dissonance that forced the women to reconsider much of what they had believed. One morning, a team from the International Committee of the Red Cross arrived at the camp. Identifiable by their armbands, notebooks, and the quiet authority with which they moved through each section. The women watched from behind the wire as the delegates inspected tents, water barrels, medical supplies, and food stockpiles. They spoke with the American officers, then requested to speak privately with several of the prisoners. This was not staged. This was not for show. It was procedure, and proof that the women were not disappearing into a void. When the Red Cross delegates approached the female enclosure, they greeted the women in German, took notes meticulously, and asked about treatment, food, health, and conditions during capture. They inspected the tents and confirmed that male guards were stationed outside the wire, not inside the sleeping area, a regulation the Americans clearly observed. For many of the prisoners, the visit illuminated something profound. They were part of a system governed by law, a system the Americans actually followed. It stood in stark contrast to the secrecy and improvised brutality that had often been normal in German-run camps earlier in the war. Letters to home. A week later, the American staff distributed Red Cross message forms, the first chance the women had to communicate with their families since their capture. One by one, they bent over wooden tables, carefully writing short, restricted messages. I am alive. I am healthy. I am safe as a prisoner. I hope you are all right. For some, writing these words broke through the emotional numbness that had held them since surrender. A few women cried quietly as they folded the forms, not because of fear, but because this was the first moment they felt something like relief. Even a sliver of connection to home made captivity feel less like disappearance and more like survival. As the days stretched into weeks, the women began to understand an uncomfortable reality. Their captivity was not the defining event of their lives. Their defeat was. Inside the American camp, stripped of uniforms, ranks, and ideological expectations, they were no longer clerks of the Luftwaffe, assistants of the Red Cross, or auxiliaries of the Wehrmacht. They were simply women, displaced, confused, and struggling to understand the world that had emerged from the wreckage of their nation. This shift was subtle but immense. The war had taken their structure. Captivity replaced it with reflection. Rumors from newly arriving POWs brought news of Germany collapsing city by city. Berlin surrounded. Hitler isolated. Civilians fleeing in every direction. Towns surrendering before American units even reached them. Every update deepened the realization that the Reich had not simply lost the war, it had imploded. And because of that, the future was a blank page. By the end of May, the women understood something they could not have grasped on the morning of their capture. The world they had known was gone. The ideology that shaped their youth was in ruins. The nation that had defined them was no longer the one they had served. Their lives, identities, and beliefs would have to be rebuilt from the ground up. Once they were released, repatriated, and returned to whatever remained of home. And that understanding, more than the capture, more than the journey, more than the processing, was the true weight of the aftermath. Their war was over, but the consequences were only beginning to unfold. In the quiet weeks that followed their capture, The women in the American enclosure found themselves confronting a truth that had slowly taken shape since the moment the first jazz notes drifted across the morning air. The war had not simply ended around them. It had ended within them. They had entered captivity expecting brutality, humiliation, and revenge. Instead, they found rules, procedures, and a level of restraint they had never witnessed in their own country's treatment of prisoners. The Americans were strict, but not cruel, distant, but not hateful. There was no ideological theater in the camp, no propaganda, no indoctrination. Just order, rations, paperwork, and the long silence that comes after years of certainty collapse. That silence changed them. It forced reflection in ways the Reich had never allowed. Reflection on obedience, on belief, on fear, on the machinery of a system that had consumed their youth. They were not responsible for the war's creation, but they had participated in its function. Now, with the conflict over, they were left to consider what that participation meant. For many of them, the moment of transformation was not dramatic. It happened gradually, in the calm professionalism of the guards, in the neutrality of the medical staff, in the Red Cross visits, and in the small, fragile privilege of writing a letter home. It happened in the stark contrast between propaganda and reality, and in the realization that their understanding of the enemy had been incomplete at best, manipulated at worst. And yet, perhaps the most symbolic moment remained the simplest one. The morning when American jazz poured through the stillness of a captured field, startling a group of young women who had never been allowed to hear it. The music did not change their fate, but it changed their perception. And sometimes, perception is where history turns. In the end, their story is not one of triumph or tragedy, but of awakening, slow, difficult quiet. A reminder that even in the final days of a devastating war, humanity can appear in the smallest gestures, the softest actions, the unexpected sound of a foreign melody drifting across a broken landscape. And in that sound, for the first time, they heard the beginning of the world to come.